So I'll go out on a limb to say that I think that's going to be a little bit more consequential than we might be anticipating in this discussion, predominantly admittedly, because of the late switch and late entry into the race. Other than the ABC interview last week, which was only 15 minutes, essentially, Harris hasn't done much in terms of podcasts, interviews, etc. So that's becoming extrapolated by conservative media as her vulnerability. So I think there'll be a lot of attention to this particular debate just because she hasn't really had too many forums where she's being quizzed.
All you timeless children with your predictions and flashbacks, trying to get ahead. What makes you think I can see you? What makes you think I believe you? Dreams, psychopath. Have you heard me play? You stepping up waiting, shot from the past. All the dreams are flying, all the thoughts are dying. Heard from the past.
Welcome back to the Prediction Trade. It is Thursday, September 5th, 2024. I'm your host, Chris Vecchio, joined by my co-host, Jeff Joseph. And today we're joined by a special guest, American political scientist. You may know her from MSNBC, The Bill Maher Show, tumbling in the streets of Twitter with her many haters and fighters. Also from her new book, it's Rachel Bitterkofer joining the Prediction Trade this Thursday. Rachel, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here again and to talk a little bit about, the elections and what we're looking at.
Welcome, Rachel.
And Jeff,
it's been a while. I feel as though I'm part of your induction into the Prediction Markets Hall of Fame. You were an early guest a couple years ago on the Prediction Trade, and we had you back a couple times because of your insights in the market. And in the course of doing that, I know you got pretty excited about prediction markets in general. Have they become more a part of your daily reference as you're looking at polls and looking for context relative to them?
Yeah, I suppose you want me to answer that honestly, so I'm going to. The markets are a little slow for me. Okay, so they're highly reactive to a couple of key influencers like
Exactly
Nate Silver, right? So I will check and see. My assumption is the stock right now on the presidential election winners being held down almost entirely by Silver's model, right? So I do like to keep an eye on it. The prediction markets are important, but there are only so many people playing on them or reliant on these polls-based forecasts, right? And, not to take away from that incredible modeling, both 538 under Elliott does, and of course, Nate's modeling is really good. It's a good forecast model, but it is not so good at the part with the forecast, right? It's data that can tell you what's happening today, but it's not so good at telling you what's going to happen tomorrow. And I think that's really where I come in.
And if I can piggyback on that, and I think, Chris, it's one of the reasons why we do this show, the Prediction Trade, is that our main thesis is that although liquid to an appropriate degree, these markets are relatively inefficient. The prediction markets, as you said, they're lagging, they overreact to certain news events. And because of that, it creates these opportunities where you can find expected value, what Chris and I have been talking about over recent segments. And that's what we're really interested in hearing from you today, where you see value when we look at some of these markets. But Chris, why don't you get us started? But before that, let me do another plug. Let's mention your book title. It's Hit 'em Where It Hurts, How to Save Democracy by Beating Republicans at Their Own Game. That's your book right now. That's available, of course, on Amazon or anywhere else. You can subscribe to The Cycle on Substack, which is your letter there. And of course, follow you at Rachel Bitterkofer, Bitcofer, on X, formerly Twitter. So again, good to have you on. Chris, what do we have in store for Rachel?
Rachel, you actually got us pointed in the right direction to start off with. Let's talk about some of these national polls and how they're impacting the betting markets here. I can see while the national polls are moving perhaps in Harris's favor, you mentioned Nate Silver and his newsletter, The Silver Bulletin, have actually been pushing the electoral college odds in Trump's favor in recent days. Is this all about Pennsylvania? Does this have to do with RFK dropping out? Why are we seeing these shifts here? And why do you think there's a cap right now on Harris's odds for president?
Yeah, it's media narrative, right? So who are your investors relying on. They're relying on an analyst, maybe TV, maybe Silver, whoever it is, right? And then they're making their political decisions. That's why you plugged my blog. If you were a subscriber to the Cycle on Substack, over the course of this last month, you started buying Democratic stock pretty much the day after the switch, right? Because I was like, this is there's a pent up demand in the electorate for one thing. And Nikki Haley was absolutely spot on. She said there's a pent up demand for whichever party who doesn't nominate an old man. Okay. And that would have been a good demand in February. It was pent up. But by July and post that disastrous debate, it became a fire of demand, right? And the Democrats unpredictably, almost impossibly satisfied that demand. They switched the nominee. It's a rally around the new nominee, and now the voters have what they want. And I knew that there's very few things that can move a fundamental. For example, in 2020, I knew that the Democrats had the edge in that election, and then that was before the pandemic came in, right? And I put out a post about how the pandemic wasn't going to move much opinion because we're so polarized, kind of anticipate what's going to happen coming down the line. You get Dobbs in 2022. And if you'll recall, some of us were very clear that this was going to change the midterm fundamentals from a typical midterm effect. Analysts, especially the ones that move these markets, were very skeptical and you could argue didn't really understand how impactful Dobbs was going to be. And now we have a third thing, a disruption that is the switch. The switch has changed all the fundamentals, and now we're moving into where I thought we would be a month ago, which was a stasis. The stasis for the last first 6 months or 8 months of the year was it's always a toss-up. We're hyper partisan, closely divided. Electoral college guarantees every election is going to be a toss-up, but for 6 months it was toss-up advantage Trump, right? And we're going to spend the rest of the cycle toss-up advantage Harris. And that's a huge difference maker, especially down ballot.
Well, Chris, if I may, let me parse that out a little bit, referring to what you brought up, Nate Silver. First of all, it's great to see Nate Silver still is relevant, perhaps more so than ever, after leaving 538 and Disney to the Silver Bulletin. But let's update as to what he said within the last 24 hours. He said that Trump is now favored to win the Electoral College by his widest margin in months, but that's only moving him from 52.4% to 58.2%. He said that the DNC bounce did not sustain for Harris. He sees her as a slight underdog in Pennsylvania. And we'd like to have your take on that, Rachel. And then there's other polls around it, right? The latest YouGov poll, the national poll has Harris up 2. A recent Detroit News poll has Trump up 1 in Pennsylvania. And latest CNN polls across the board were much better for Harris, but had her as a dead heat in Pennsylvania. So with those polls in mind, what's your kind of assessment as to how we've evolved post-DNC now, post the DNC bump?
Yeah, I mean, I want to respond a little bit to the Silver Bulletin thing, right? Because now he's doing these daily updates. And you have to believe, right, that the probability swung 10 points in 2 days between these forecasts, right? So like it just goes to show how poll-centric his forecasting work is and why I'm skeptical about it so much, especially this cycle. But that's at the end of the day, people are like, oh, she needs to be +5. I think that we may well hit that. I mean, for us, the election's been going on for months and we're coming up to the end. For normal human beings in this country, the election just started because it's like the first few days after Labor Day. It's literally like the beginning of the cycle. Now, the switch screwed that up a little bit, right? The switch kind of made politics salient before Labor Day. And I think that's why we've seen so much movement. But I would argue that we probably haven't even seen Kamala's polling top out yet.
Rachel, in your book, you have a bunch of different insights that you share about ways that Democrats can work towards defeating Republicans. And obviously, this is a partisan talking point and an angle here, but let's go into that a little bit. If Harris is winning this election, right? What insights would you offer? What signposts would you look along towards that road to November 5th to give you greater confidence in saying, I should be betting on a Harris winning the presidency?
Yeah, sure. And again, go read the blog if you're trying to make educated betting decisions, because I talk about these indicators, right? So polling is what we call a soft indicator. And the reason why is that, not to pick on you, but you're quoting, Trump's up 1 in Pennsylvania. Well, when you say that, I know that it means there's a statistical, basically a margin of error tie, right?
That's right.
In that, and that it just means it's so close that within the margins of error, the capabilities that a survey can give us, it's so error prone in so many ways, and margin of error is just one of the errors. There's many errors laid on top of that all it's going to tell us, all the polling can tell us from here to the end of the day is 2 things. Number one, if it's an expanded map like they initially thought they would have in New Hampshire and Virginia, they had the Trump campaign posturing like that, or if it's a constricting defensive map for them now, and it's a constricting defensive map for them now. They're pulling out of Virginia, pulling out of New Hampshire. They are feeling like, okay, we got to put everything, and you look at the spending, which has been really interesting this cycle. They're pounding everything into Pennsylvania, though you have to hold all 3 of the blue wall states. So I'm not really sure what motivates that strategy. But the polling.
By the way, Rachel, I saw those reports today in The Guardian. Do you concur with that? Are you seeing that the Trump campaign is pulling out of those 3 states and really allocating more resources towards Pennsylvania?
Yes, they didn't want us to know that, but unfortunately for them, a low-level staffer told the media that, right? But those of us that are smart already can see this campaign is struggling big time. Kamala Harris just not just outraised him in August, she more than doubled his haul, 300 million versus 120 or something like that, right? So the hard data is what I'm interested in, and have been waiting when it was Biden, before the debate, when it was Biden, I was like, okay, we got to get into September so we can see some of these hard metrics when people tune in. But now, because of the switch, now we know volunteerism is through the roof across the map. Even in states like Florida, we're seeing massive show up. Kamala's started off filling 20-person arenas. Obama started at 20K. By the fall of 2008, he was filling 80K. Okay, so who knows what the cap of that excitement is, right? And then you look at the fundraising activity, especially the GOP smart people now are all directing their money down to the Senate map, because they're starting to really see and understand they're going to lose this presidential race again, and probably the House, because the House margin's so narrow, and that if they want to have a stopgap, it's going to be in that Senate race, right? So the registration data, the first thing I wanted to know, and I had to wait a month. 538 had to wait a month too. Coming out with a model a week after a candidate switch is very sketchy to me. So 538 waited a long time to put out their model because they needed new data, because you couldn't use your old data. And you can see that in the data, because when Kamala Harris was an unknown hypothetical, no one liked her. Okay, no one knew who she was. No one liked her. And then as soon as she became the real deal, those favorability ratings changed profoundly, right? That's because to the electorate, these hypothetical people, they don't even know mostly who they are, and they don't have particularly strong opinions to them. So they rely a lot on just kind of partisan instinct, right? It's really important for people to know that the hard data for registration, after we had the time period that we needed to absorb that, because July is noisy, we needed all of August, has shown a massive spike of enthusiasm. And so enthusiasm is the thing that made me so confident for the out party in 2020, that I put a New York Times article out predicting a Democratic win before there was even a Democratic nominee. Enthusiasm was the angst of Dobbs that saved us, and the strategic shifts I talk about us making in the book saved us against the midterm effect. And now that enthusiasm differential is gone. And in fact, if anything, it's kind of hard not to argue that there seems to be an enthusiasm differential the other way right now, where the Harris-Walz campaign really got a lot of energy that you would want to see going into the stretch.
Rachel, obviously we have this expression in politics that no one pays attention to anything before Labor Day, and debates don't really matter. Obviously, this year has upended those assumptions. The June 27th debate will probably be the most consequential debate in American history. Perhaps September 10th can be the second most consequential. This could be one of those touchstone points that helps reshape the narrative around the election, of course, than what happens in betting markets here. So should we be raising our expectations, curbing our enthusiasm for September 10th, or is this going to be a clarifying moment that perhaps drives the 10% swing in the electoral college odds, the odds for Georgia, the odds for Wisconsin? Does September 10th matter as much as the media is hyping it up to be?
So, as a political scientist, what we talk about all the time in campaigns is minimal effects. And the general election debates have minimal effects because partisanship is what dictates the vote choice for 90% of the electorate, including most people who claim to be independents, right? So I just, in the cycle on Substack where, I've updated people, I just talked about this. And I said, from now on, when I teach that, I'm not a professor anymore, but if I was still teaching that course, I'd have to put a little asterisk next to it that said, except for that first debate with Joe Biden in 2024. But Christopher, I'm pointing that out because I've heard you say, well, that's totally changed everything. No, okay, exceptions don't make rules. Exceptions don't make rules. It's very unlikely to me that this debate is going to have a profound impact. But that said, I do think Kamala Harris is well positioned to get to that +5, +6 in the national polling that she really wants to see for the silver bulletin model to start picking up that she's poised a pretty set up for the electoral college at this point. Well, keeping in mind with New Hampshire and Virginia and Colorado, which the Trump team is essentially conceding they can't win, you just need Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. That's it.
Let me offer up a contrarian viewpoint there. I think maybe you might be placing another asterisk next to this debate. So I'll go out on a limb to say that I think that's going to be a little bit more consequential than we might be anticipating in this discussion. Predominantly because of the late switch and late entry into the race, other than the ABC interview last week, which was only 15 minutes, essentially, Harris hasn't done much in terms of podcasts, interviews, et cetera. So that's becoming extrapolated by conservative media as her vulnerability. So I think there'll be a lot of attention to this particular debate just because she hasn't really had too many forums where she's being quizzed. Well, actually, she hasn't had any forum where she's really being aggressively quizzed or held accountable to policy. And I think because of that, I'm certainly not predicting an outcome, but I think because of that, the next event to move the needle in the betting markets will likely be the debate having equal significance as to what the DNC was to her campaign. Could add another bounce of a couple points, and it could go the other way depending on the outcome. At least that's my take on it. I'll borrow something. I don't know if you know, Sam Khan does a nice story on Substack, but he wrote today, this is electioneering in the digital age where voters expect to hear directly from their candidates and to connect with them on a human level. The candidates who have learned that the most, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, et cetera, have been the most successful. So I think the point is that since there hasn't been a lot of connection yet on policy, I think it puts a lot of emphasis on September 10th. Or at least maybe I'm trying to make the case for why this is a must-watch event.
Well, I mean, it certainly shouldn't do better than what happened in June. When that debate was going to happen, nobody wanted Donald Trump or Joe Biden to run for office. B, they tried to do it in June. And so my assumption was, you run about 50, 60 million these days, which is, by the way, less than a quarter of the American population, who will tune into one of the big three general election debates, which used to be presidential commission debates, but because of Trump are now whatever, right? And so we were 20 million viewers shy in that first debate. Of course, it ended up creating a narrative that went far beyond its viewership, right? But my hope is that we'll see 50 or 60 million viewers back for this first debate. Mm-hmm. I do want to tell you this, though. Like, one of the things that is difficult for partisans is to appreciate the strengths of opposition members, right? And I kind of pride myself on not being that kind of person. Republicans love to do this. They have created this fake Kamala Harris that they're running against in their own mind. She doesn't know how to talk. She can't do a full sentence. She's running away from the media, even though she inherited a campaign operation in August, guys. So, it's like, what are you going to prioritize? The actual nuts and bolts of election stumping or, media narratives? But the right will always find something to exploit like that. So I'm delighted that they've done that because the expectations bar goes down.
That's right.
And, this idea that she hasn't been tried, sorry, buddy. She debated Mike Pence. She's the sitting vice president. She debated Mike Pence quite handily, I would add. And I think she's going to eat Donald Trump up. And the reason why is if you look back at how she handled hostile witnesses in committee, right? This is no wussy, all I can say, right? So I think people are going to be in for a surprise if they've bought into this narrative. And I had reporters calling me for 4 years. Oh, Kamala Harris, could I ask you about why is she so ineffective, or why is the perception that she's ineffective? I'm like, there's only been one vice president in history that was effective because it actually did something other than attend funerals and official events, right? And that, of course, was Dick Cheney. And that something was to lie us into the Iraq War. The vice presidential role is designed to be inefficient and not do anything. It's not a power role, right? And so it's great to me that people have internalized these talking points so much that they are underestimating their opponent at their own peril.
I actually see September 10th as fairly instrumental, more so for Trump than Harris. If you watch the June 27th debate, it's not exactly like Trump had a good debate. It was so overshadowed by what happened with Joe Biden's crash and burn. And you mentioned that they have there's this sort of bigotry of low expectations. It's why the State of the Union seemed so strong, because everyone expected Biden to come out and basically drool for an hour. And they did that again going into June 27th, which is what made it even so more shocking, because it was worse than the low expectations that were laid out. Right? It was so much worse than the low expectations that were laid out. So going to September 10th, if Harris is she needs to put some meat on the bones. She needs to talk to some real policy issues. But if Trump goes up there and he talks about his uncles from MIT who thinks he's a genius, who are weaving great stories, and English poets and professors, can't believe these tales about car batteries and Hannibal Lecter, it may not be about Harris anymore. It becomes more about this referendum on Trump, which is, to me, the most spectacular framing about this election. You could easily make this a referendum on a second term of Biden. She's part of the administration. And yet it's back to being a referendum on Trump right now. Do we want to go backwards or forwards? Yep. He's not defining her well, and so she's defining this race. Do you think that RFK dropping out, Rachel, is a material game changer for getting more people into the Trump column, like Tulsi Gabbard? They're kind of doing this whole thing, and Trump's posting these memes of him as Superman, and all these other Democrats are coming around him like the Justice League. Are these meaningful shifts for the election, or is this like Liz Cheney endorsing Kamala?
Before you answer, let me add some data to that. YouGov poll released 3 days ago, 3 days before Kennedy's withdrawal, found that registered Republicans were backing him on a 3-to-1 ratio. Polling data released the day before he dropped out said that Kennedy voters would break for Trump nationally by a 59-41 margin, and the nonpartisan Quick Political Report found that Trump would take 46% of Kennedy's supporters, with only 26% going to Harris. So what's your thoughts on those numbers?
I don't imagine that it will be consequential, especially for the fact that Kennedy's on the ballot in these swing states. As long as his name is on that ballot, the people who are going to cast ballots are very particular types of people. In fact, they're mostly white male independents that vote third party. Those are your people that vote third party. Women don't tend to, minorities don't tend to. It's white dudes like you guys, right? And they're not, particularly, they're just a very ideologically noisy group of people. So I'm not worried about it at all. A month ago, before the switch, it was for me shaping up to be very much like 2016, where third party defection was going to be just enough, with lackluster turnout and enthusiasm from the left, the complacency that they get when they're in power, to potentially put Trump back in the almost the exact same way that he got there in 2016. But that third party threat really decimated. Now, let me tell you why, because in the data you had double hate, right? In my academic book on 16, I have a chapter called Everybody Sucks 2016, right? And it was about how when the electorate hates both people, you have a situation where you develop double haters, and that third party vote becomes more attractive. Well, now we don't have double haters. We have one hater, and that's Donald Trump. People don't like him, right? The independent pool does not like him. And, Chris is observing the strategic shift. Now, he may not be thinking about it as a strategic shift, but this referendum on Trump is a strategic shift. For me, if I'm doing debate prep with Harris, I am much less focused on her articulating her wonky Democratic wish list than I am on making sure people understand Donald Trump has proposed to eliminate the entire federal income tax system and impose instead a 10% tariff on everything that you buy. If you think you've experienced inflation today, friends, wait till tomorrow, because this is an economic theory that was discredited more than 150 years ago, right? It's Moot-Hawley, basically 2.0. So if I was her, every time an opportunity, because with him, it's crazy electric shark boats, stream of conscious. Everything was great when I was the president. Everything was better. Everyone had a pony, right? Like that's the stuff that he's capable of producing.
I actually had 2 ponies.
But in between, or when it comes to her, she should use those opportunities always to pivot and attack him on the crazy shit that he is proposing, because we haven't even talked about Project 2025, which will collapse the constitutional order. So, I want to have a good policy debate. It's interesting to me that the media is suddenly interested in policy, because Trump has had this stuff on his website, Agenda 47, right there, mass deportations, closing the Department of Education. That's some crazy shit, guys. And yet people don't seem to really want to talk about that, right? So, I just think it's easy to buy into some kind of these commentariat narratives a little bit. Like, oh, Kamala has to have policy to win. But I think her team, given that the constraint of inheriting a fully functional in the field, 150, now it's more field offices in operation campaign, is going to limit the other stuff you can do, like going on to YouTube or whatever. But it is, to me, probably the best thing about it is that it gave Republicans zero window of time to to frame opinion about Kamala Harris. And that's really strategically their biggest obstacle, is that, it was the obstacle Biden had before, because if you read my book, you're going to find out how freakish you are if you listen to this and bet on politics in terms of information and interest in politics. Most people have zero interest in politics. And that is why, despite all these achievements, the PAC Act, the CHIP Act, the Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, these are 4 major legislative achievements, right? And the voters don't know about them. Why? They don't watch the news. Now, that was bad for Biden, but now it's bad for Donald Trump, because he needs to define this wonderful, smiley cooking woman who dances a lot, and Tim Walz, the guy that hugs pigs, as bad guys in 2 months, dude. That's really tough. It's a very, very tough strategic lift.
Well, it's spoken like a true policy wonk, or a true political wonk, I should say, that policy doesn't matter, because you're probably right. She's been running a pretty strategic campaign based on avoiding, for the most part, policy issues, and running on a feel-good mentality that's capturing a lot. That, as you said, listen, I agree with every assessment you've made today, including what she did to the enthusiasm gap, which was really, hurting the Democrats in a very big way. Biden had literally no enthusiasm. And I agree with your secondary premise that she likely turned it around. I would still go back to saying, and I'm curious how you quantify whatever independents are left out there, because, the last election was decided by about 43,000 votes in 3 different states. Joe Jorgensen, whom we had on the podcast, the prediction trade, last time around, the Libertarian candidate, ended up with 1.9 million votes. That was 1.2% of the electorate. So what's your thought as to how the third party, if any third party vote, there's still Cornel West out there. Do you think there's going to be any impact there? And who does it tilt towards?
It can always have an impact. When we're talking about races that will be decided by 11,000 votes, right? It'd be crazy not to argue. But like the way it had an impact in 16, guys, let me put this into perspective. The famous spoiler race that analysts on TV other than me always talk about is 2000 in Florida with Ralph Nader, where Ralph Nader supposedly helped George Bush, okay? And there was about 1.2% defection rate in Florida in that cycle. It was about comparable to what that candidate performed as. In Wisconsin in 2016, it was 6.32%. Okay, that's not going to happen here. Like that was a unique. If it had still been Joe Biden, it might have, and we were headed towards that. But now it's completely different fundamentals. So, is it possible that a swing state like Georgia or Pennsylvania or Michigan will be within a margin that, the 1% that gets wasted on Cornell Belcher elects Donald Trump? Absolutely. And that's why I always tell people don't vote for third party. James, I want to say one more thing, though, about the policy positioning and the detail and stuff, right? Now, think about if you're Kamala Harris, what is her campaign about? Well, Trump's campaign is very clear. It's a MAGA-centric base mobilization campaign with no persuasion element. And that was doubled down with the pick of J.D. Vance. Generally speaking, you pick a VP to balance the ticket. There's no balance pick from J.D. Vance. I'll say that's because the only qualification Trump cared about was, will this person be willing to stand by why I degrade the Constitution? Because Mike Pence failed that test, right? Nikki Haley was never going to pass that test. That's why I could have made some good money betting against all you people buying Haley stock, because I knew 100% it was never going to be Haley, right? And the important thing for people to understand about that is that with Trump, he's got this pure mobilization campaign. The persuasion, not only is J.D. Vance not a persuasion candidate like Tim Kaine or Mike Pence. Mike Pence was designed to bring the evangelicals. J.D. Vance is isolating the electorate and particularly inflaming the one element of the electorate you didn't want to inflame, which is women, right? So it's like, you're getting like no electoral benefit from J.D. Vance, but you tend to pick a candidate that's going to add value to the ticket. And so it's kind of interesting to see strategically where Trump is, how he's going to appeal to independents with that. And we're not just talking about independents. Let's be frank. We're talking about suburban independents outside of the major cities of Detroit, of Philly, of Pittsburgh, of Green Bay, of Milwaukee, and even some northern Chicago suburbs. These are the people that will decide the election and control of the House, right? And the message that Democrats and Republicans are taking to them is, be afraid. If you don't want your neighborhood to turn into a Venezuelan gang, you better vote Trump. And the message that is competing this cycle is, be afraid. If you want to lose your freedom and your individual rights, vote Trump, right? We actually have, for once, a messaging symmetry. They're doing their stuff and we're matching it with a similar approach that is meant to degrade it. So, I feel like people should start buying some Harris stuff.
Well, Rachel, we never have enough time with you, and today's no different.